work here at the House from time to time is that they call votes on the floor. And that's audacious, isn't it, that they would expect that we would have to vote. But anyway, I believe some of the other committee members that were planning on being here will be here soon. But I'd like to welcome everybody here today to the second of our two-part series of hearings on regional security. As you may recall, a few weeks ago we focused on the Merida Initiative and the direction in which our security cooperation with the world's highest homicide rates, replacing Ciudad Juarez last year as the world's most violent city. Poverty, crime, public corruption, and a legacy of violence in the region have created a perfect storm that critically hampers economic growth and opportunity, luring youth into a seemingly endless cycle of crime and drug trafficking. Interdiction alone, Mexico is headed particularly with the change of leadership in Mexico to, I think, some interesting developments. But this week we're going to delve into the security situation in Central America and the Caribbean Basin and examine programs we've undertaken in the region to deal with combating drug trafficking organizations to help the nations of both regions combat violence and criminality. The security situation in most countries of Central America and the Caribbean remains critical. Gangs and organized criminals continue to operate with impunity. Prisons are substandard and overcrowded. Corruption remains endemic, and the justice and law enforcement sectors simply lack capacity. Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, known as the Northern Triangle, suffer from excessive violence. San Pedro Sula in Honduras has the world's highest homicide rates, interdiction alone has proven insufficient in dealing with serious problems that plague the region. Through CARSI and CBSI, the United States has led the effort in assisting the region to address the underlying causes of what seems like a regional point of no return. States Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement, INL, and USAID have put together a set of programs designed to help the region's law enforcement agencies contend with the creeping presence of the Zetas and Sinaloa cartels, while enabling municipal and federal police forces to acquire the appropriate tools necessary to minimize corruption and human rights violations. In addition, U.S. personnel have worked diligently with regional partners in an effort to bring effective and sustainable justice sector reforms to the region, while USAID has worked with local and regional non-governmental organizations to enable communities to partner with the private sector to take the citizen security and prevention bull by the horn, so to speak. I don't doubt that our efforts are earnest, but I'm looking forward to hearing from both panels today about whether those efforts have yielded measurable success and if the political will exists within Central American, Caribbean governments to press with real results. The horrifying statistics from the region underscore that our efforts are needed, but we're only making a dent in the problem at this point. We need dedicated and strong-willed partners if we're to make progress, and progress cannot be made without a series of unwavering commitments to transparency, human rights, and grit from the governments of the region. As Chairman of the Subcommittee, I maintain that working with and assisting our neighbors in Mexico, Central America, and Caribbean to build the necessary capacity to deal with these challenges is in our national interest. Our region is interconnected not only geographically but culturally and economically. At the risk of sounding like a broken record, economic growth and prosperity in Central and South America will lead to more growth and prosperity in the United States. Regional security matters. Without security, the countries of Central America and the Caribbean will lack the ability to grow their economies, give their youth the opportunity and incentive to move to the next generation of peace and prosperity. And as you may know, I did serve in Congress previously from 1995 to 2001, and I served on the Foreign Relations Committee there. So I've seen my fair share of summits and regional meetings where there's plenty of talk, good intentions, lofty goals, but often too little in terms of execution and follow-through. The people of the United States have always been generous and dedicated to helping our friends and neighbors through tough times. Even in this time of tight budgets, Americans are kind enough and practical enough to remain engaged and help the region. That said, Americans rarely enjoy throwing good money after bad, and we've got to make sure that what we do works. I see our efforts in Central America and the Caribbean as important, and they need to continue. I want the people of those nations to have a society that is free of corruption, where law enforcement works for its people to ensure their security, where justice system is transparent and fair, and most importantly, where young people no longer have to turn to a life of violence, gangs, and drug trafficking. I'm extremely happy that Ambassador Bill Brownfield is back before the committee again to tell us about INL's efforts in Central America and the Caribbean. And after our hearing on Mexico and the Merida Initiative, my subcommittee staff led a delegation to Mexico City and cities in northern Mexico, where INL is working diligently to help the Mexican government build capacity, train law enforcement, and strengthen and reform the justice sector to effectively deal with all of the problems associated with transnational criminal and drug trafficking organizations. What we learned is that there is still a lot of work ahead for us and our partners in Mexico, that this is a long-term but vital undertaking. Ambassador Brownfield, your staff throughout Mexico is professional, dedicated, and up to the task. I was happy to learn that your office in Mexico has developed a program called Same Page that provides an efficient and clear way to track projects and expenditures. The taxpayer appreciates and deserves that level of accountability. I'm pleased that the law enforcement trainers and other staff you've placed in the field are dedicated and hardworking Americans. Thank you, and thank them for their service. I'm grateful to both Deputy Assistant Secretary Ayalde and Mark Lopez from USAID for being here to testify. Working in tandem with INL, I'm hopeful that your respective agencies can build on work already done to more efficiently and effectively tackle the worsening situation in the region. I'm also looking forward to hearing from our private panel, Mr. Eric Olson from the Woodrow Wilson Center, who just returned this week from Central America and will hopefully give us a clear picture of just how dire the security situation is in the region. We also have Mr. Michael Shifter, who is the president of the Inter-American Dialogue, who has written extensively on this topic. Thank you all for being here today, for taking the time to discuss regional security issues and the growing threat of violence and criminality in Central America and the Caribbean. I look forward to a productive and informative hearing, and I will now recognize the ranking member for his remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today, and thank you for your patience. Today's discussion on the security situation in Central America and the Caribbean is both timely and long overdue. While merited efforts to combat criminal threats and reduce drug trafficking and related violence in Mexico has diverted our attention from the public security crisis that has emerged in Central America. The deteriorated state of security in the region is a byproduct of gangs, organized crime groups, drug traffickers that have spilled over from Mexico in attempts to control the drug trade, co-opting local crime organizations into their network to smuggle drugs, people, and illicit goods and weapons. And while the Caribbean is not the dominant transit point of choice for the illicit drugs into the U.S., it would be naive for us to ignore the possibility that a pressure on drug traffickers in Mexico and Central America increases. The Caribbean will become a viable and attractive alternative for illicit activity. The most basic functions for any government is to protect its citizens. With some of the highest homicide rates in the world amongst the Northern Triangle countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, citizen security remains an issue. For some countries, post-conflict institutional reform in the 1990s have left already weak government with a broken justice system, corrupt police forces, and poverty-stricken, unequal societies. With the persistent unemployment and the lack of social mobility, many Central American youth have either immigrated to the United States or been recruited by criminal groups. As a result, major Central American populations now live in the United States, and for some Central American countries, remittance represents between 10 to 20% of the GDP. It is unfortunate when the choice of young adult is to either leave one's homeland or face a life of poverty alongside constant threats to join gangs or other criminal organizations. I have been concerned with the rise of Central American gangs into the criminal activities and the constant threat they pose to susceptible youth and weak governments, particularly El Salvador and Honduras. Homicides and drug-related violence remain serious obstacles to the peace and security of Central Americans. According to the UN, Mexico, a country with 112 million people, had in 2011 a homicide rate of 23.7% per 100,000 people, El Salvador, with a population of 6 million, had a rate of 69.2, and Honduras, with a population of almost 8.5 million, had a homicide rate at a staggering 91.6. These facts remain our These facts reinforce our need to ensure that the Central American Security Initiative and the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative, one, broad enough to dismantle a transitional crime organization and curb illicit drug flows with crime prevention and institutional building efforts to strengthen the rule of law, and two, are implemented in the coordinated manner within the U.S. agencies and partners countries, while remaining dynamic enough to address both current and potential threats as seen in the Caribbean. It will be in our best interest not to overlook security concerns in the Caribbean. Today, nearly $500 million have been appropriated for CARSI, and about $200 million have been appropriated for CBSI. However, recent Government Accounting Office reports suggest that less than 28% of CARSI's funds and roughly 90% of CBSI funds have been distributed. This committee needs to understand why such funding has not been carried out in an efficient manner. I look forward to hearing from our panelists regarding this assessment of these security initiatives, as well as their determination of the current state of security in Central America and the Caribbean. Transforming a generation of corrupt behavior, strengthening the rule of law, implementing long-due institutional reform, and creating a more inclusive society for youth prone to illicit activities will take time and determination. However, the United States must approach these initiatives with a goal of transferring ownership to Central American leadership. Ultimately, it is the people of Central America that are responsible, subject the public and the political will to take this difficult task on. Thank you.
Thank you. Recognize the gentlewoman from Florida.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And when talking about security in this hemisphere, we must not forget about Cuba, the state sponsor of terrorism 90 miles from my district. In the last 2 months, the Obama administration has granted a U.S. visa to Raul Castro's daughter and returned to Cuba a convicted spy without having him finish his sentence here in the U.S. This week, we find that the State Department is engaging the Castro regime in direct mail and migration talks. The Castro regime will not, has not, never has complied with any international agreement. In fact, just a few years ago, the regime signed 2 international human rights accords. Yet the tensions on the island have risen. Valiant defenders of democracy like Las Damas de Blanco, the ladies in white, face weekly beatings. In addition, it is the Castro regime that does not comply with the mail accords that we signed with him from years ago. Meanwhile, a U.S. citizen languishes unjustly in a Cuban prison. Cuban activists, as we speak, are risking their lives on hunger strikes, and over 70 refugees, 70 fugitives from safe haven have gone to Cuba for safe haven. They're fugitives from U.S. law, including, as you know, Mr. Sirius, a cop killer from New Jersey. What's next with this administration? Enough is enough. Basta ya. The Cuban people deserve freedom and democracy just as all oppressed people do, and these talks will not help them achieve those goals. And, Mr. Chairman, during the question and answer period, I look forward to asking our witnesses about the capacity and the willingness and the capability of the Caribbean nations to fight drug trafficking, and whether the Mexican drug cartels are penetrating any of these countries. We've heard a lot about the Dominican Republic having been infiltrated by them. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7, the members of the subcommittee will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the official hearing record. And without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 7 days to allow statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. I'd like to introduce the first panel. Ambassador Brownfield is the Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs. Prior to his appointment, Mr. Brownfield served as U.S. Ambassador to Colombia, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and the Republic of Chile. Pretty easy career there. Ambassador Brownfield is a graduate of Cornell University and the National War College. He also attended the University of Texas School of Law. Mark Lopez is the Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Bureau of Latin America and the Caribbean. He was formerly the Senior Foreign Policy Advisor, Staff Director for the Chairman of the International Development and Foreign Assistance Committee of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Prior to that, he served on the State Foreign Operations and Related Programs Subcommittee of the House Appropriations Committee. Mr. Lopez holds a BM from Berklee College of Music and an MPP from Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. And I'm sorry, Mrs. Ayalde is a career minister serving as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Western Hemisphere Affairs, covering Cuba, Central America, and the Caribbean. She previously served as the USAID Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator in the Bureau for Latin America and the Caribbean. In addition, Mrs. Ayalde served as the United States Ambassador to Paraguay from 2008 to 2011. She holds a BA from American University in International Studies and a master's degree in International Public Health from Tulane University. And also, I understand that you've been nominated to be ambassador to Brazil, which is fantastic. We were just there, and they need a great person like you. So, best of luck. And without further ado, I keep calling him Ambassador Brownfield, but we'll start with you.
You may call me whatever you wish, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Sires, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss CARSI and CBSI initiatives. Our strategic assessment is very simple. We believe the region suffers from a surge in drug trafficking and violence, and all nations are affected. As efforts succeed in Colombia and Mexico, traffickers push into Central America and the Caribbean. Therefore, we must pursue a coordinated strategy throughout the region. As the American people look to Central America, they see drug flows into the United States. But the peoples of Central America see violence, crime, and homicides. Our strategy must address both drugs and violence. Between 2008 and 2012, Congress provided more than $300 million in funding to my Bureau to support law enforcement and rule of law in Central America. Most Central American governments have increased their own tax and revenue base to provide more support for security and rule of law as well. What are we doing? We support police training and internal affairs units to identify and root out corruption. But reforming an institution takes a generation, and the people have a right to improve performance now. So we support special vetted units who can work high-priority cases today. We link up with USAID's community development programs to support model police precincts in the poorest and most violent communities. We provide specialized training on drugs, criminal investigation, gangs, and special victims. And we provide training to prosecutors, judges, border guards, and corrections officials. Mr. Chairman, over the past year, homicide and violence rates have gone down throughout Central America. And I will not claim full credit for CARSI, but clearly it is one factor. If Central America is today's crisis, then the Caribbean is tomorrow's challenge. I have said it before and I repeat it today. As our efforts in Central America begin to bite, trafficking organizations will search for alternative routes and networks, and the Caribbean will look attractive. Drug flows through the Caribbean are tiny compared to Central America, but they are growing. In 1 year, they increased from 5 to 9% of total cocaine flow to the United States. CBSI is designed to work with Caribbean governments to reduce drug trafficking, strengthen citizen security, and improve justice. We are investing today to pay dividends tomorrow. We are building cooperation. Each country is different, but our programs are regional. We train police in basic and specialized law enforcement. We train prosecutors, judges, and corrections officers. We support special units to combat drug trafficking and gangs, and the Coast Guard leads maritime exercises. In Trinidad and Tobago, we work to expand the National Police Academy into a regional training hub. Law enforcement throughout the Caribbean benefits from access to the Automated Fingerprint Information System, or AFIS, in working their caseloads. Mr. Chairman, this subcommittee has been generous in supporting our efforts in Central America and the Caribbean. There are some who call this mission impossible, insisting that we will never solve the problem. I am not one of them. I agree that it took us years to get into this situation, and it will take years to get out of it. But the Hemisphere is focused as never before. The OAS dedicated its General Assembly 2 weeks ago to the drug issue. We are engaged, we are cooperating, and we are exploring new approaches and strategies. I believe we will have a good narrative to tell about Mexico and Central America. I look forward to telling it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Ms. Ayalde, sorry, I'd like to recognize you. Thank you.
Chairman Stodman, Ranking Member Sears, members of the committee, it is truly a privilege to join you here today. I appreciate the invitation and this subcommittee's continued support for the administration's efforts to partner with our neighbors in the Western Hemisphere to increase citizen security, particularly through the Central American Regional Security Initiative, CARSI, and the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative. I wish to focus my comments today on the administration's efforts to meet pressing challenges in this region and to galvanize the international community to work effectively to ensure that our combined efforts are impactful. The security needs, rule of law capacity deficits, and requirements for improved quality and quantity of basic government services for citizens of Central America and the Caribbean are beyond the capability of any single nation or donor. Therefore, an international approach to coordinating and leveraging our efforts is essential. The administration has highlighted this message at the highest levels at various international forums in recent months. President Obama visited Costa Rica in May, where he met with the 7 heads of state of the Central American Integration System, CICA, and the Dominican Republic. He emphasized to them the importance of shared partnership and our commitment to continue working with the region on issues related to security. He also emphasized the critical link between security and economic opportunity and prosperity. The President stressed that our aim is to reinforce security and opportunity in every sense, not only combating crime, but ensuring that human rights are respected and communities are secure in their access to food, energy, education, healthcare, social services, and financial and economic opportunity. Vice President Biden also championed this message when he met with the Caribbean leaders in Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago last month. Just last week, Secretary Kerry traveled to Guatemala, where he participated in the annual General Assembly of the Organization of American States, the OAS. Secretary Kerry countered the misperception that U.S. counter-narcotics policy is primarily focused on law enforcement by highlighting our comprehensive plan that addresses demand, prevention, and treatment. In April, as part of our effort to strengthen multilateral approaches to supporting Central America, the Department held the first North America CICA security dialogue in Washington. Canada, Mexico, the United States, and the 7 CICA countries participated. The dialogue provided an opportunity to discuss enhancing regional coordination on security programming and is specifically focused on the themes of precursor chemicals and violence prevention. It provided a forum where we were able to discuss these issues and begin a process of bringing additional resources and commitments to specific problems faced in both Central and North America. We have reinforced our message with much-needed support through the CARSI and CBSI initiatives that have been generously funded by Congress. And we are seeing the fruits of these efforts as partner nations demonstrate increased political will and the prioritization of their most pressing citizen security, rule of law, human rights, and prevention challenges. The Guatemalan government, for example, achieved a 20% increase in the number of murder cases brought to trial in Guatemala City over the last 2 years. In Salvador, the government's commitment to reducing urban violence has exposed over 6,000 students to the Gang Resistance Education and Training Program. In the Caribbean, Dominica recently passed a comprehensive civil asset forfeiture law with a dedicated forfeiture fund to ensure that seized illicit proceeds are used to strengthen law enforcement, prosecution, and drug abuse treatment and prevention. This is the first such law passed anywhere in the Eastern Caribbean. The government of Jamaica has embraced a comprehensive police anti-corruption program that includes an anti-corruption branch of the Jamaican Constabulary Force. We are watchful that success against the criminal enterprises in Mexico, Colombia, and Central America could drive them increasingly to the Caribbean for new opportunities and trafficking routes. With CBSI assistance, we have an opportunity to address vulnerabilities in the infrastructure, build government and law enforcement capacity, and engage at-risk youth before transnational and other criminal elements can take hold. It is only through our continued support, the support and expertise of other donor nations, and the commitments of our partners in the region that we can prevent an increase in crime in the Caribbean. As a partner of Central America and the Caribbean, it is the goal of the United States to continue to support these regional and national efforts and to utilize our diplomatic and political resources, as well as our foreign assistance, to foster enhanced levels of sustained dialogue and collaboration to turn today's citizen security challenges into catalysts for building a more secure and prosperous future for the Hemisphere. Thank you again for this opportunity to discuss these issues with you, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you. Mr. Lopez.
Thank you, Chairman Salmon, Ranking Member Sires, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. USAID's work in security is focused on addressing the root causes of crime and violence, not only because of the implications for U.S. national security, but because high levels of crime and violence threaten to stall economic and democratic progress as well. The heart of our work in this area is through prevention programs designed to complement and reinforce government efforts to improve the rule of law, strengthen the capacity of municipalities to prevent crime, and create additional educational and employment opportunities for youth most susceptible to joining gangs. To ensure that we have the greatest impact on the most people, our efforts are largely focused in high-crime urban areas of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Governments in the region are largely abandoning the previous decade's failed mano dura or iron fist crime-fighting tactics in favor of more prevention-based approaches. We welcome this change. For example, the government of Honduras declared 2013 the year of prevention. The government of El Salvador recently launched a new municipal crime prevention policy that we think is a helpful framework within which to operate. USAID is employing several novel approaches, a couple of which I'll mention here. First, because no single actor involved has all the answers, we are aggressively working as a broker to share lessons from places that have had success. Countries like Brazil and Colombia have much to offer in this respect. Also, through an agreement we signed with the City of Los Angeles, USAID is adapting the LA's proven gang reduction methods in identifying youth susceptible to joining gangs and organized crime. We are also connecting city officials in the region with their counterparts in places like Arlington, Texas, Santa Ana, California, Pinellas County, Florida, and tailoring successful models accordingly. Second, given the size and scope of these challenges, donor investments are not enough. Countries must generate and invest their own resources. For this reason, we're testing models that allow them to bring in more money, particularly at the municipal level. And in El Salvador and Honduras, we launched a revenue challenge competition to increase the collection of unpaid fees. Cities who do this well will get a modest subsidy to reinvest in crime reduction programs. The idea behind this is to invigorate local government ownership, increase resources for prevention, and thereby build their capacity to play a greater role in the solution. Third, governments and donors are not the only stakeholders, and therefore USAID is increasingly engaging with the private sector. Through partnerships with Chevron, Hanes Brands, and Starbucks, we are working to physically transform more than 150 schools in the region. We also work with telecom operators and mobile phone companies who provide free Internet access in our outreach centers and who developed a mobile crime system that enables law enforcement in 5 municipalities to track, report, and analyze real crime data. The innovations brought by these companies are as valuable, if not more valuable, as their financial contributions. And lastly, our programs under CARSI would have little impact if they were not embraced by youth in the region. Most of them have a mother, a brother, a sister, a cousin, who they can help galvanize around violence prevention. USAID is proud to support the Central American Youth Movement Against Violence, which now has chapters in all 7 Central American countries. And in February, 40 of these youth presented their ideas to the presidents of Central America at a gathering in Costa Rica. In the Caribbean, our programs are similar in spirit to those in Central America, but focus more on primary prevention, including education and government capacity building, working in close partnership with national and regional governments. Mr. Chairman, we also work across a range of other sectors under the premise that it takes more than prevention and law enforcement to advance durable security and prosperity. By keeping children in school, training young people for jobs, connecting farmers to markets, lifting rural poor out of poverty, preserving natural resources, and reaching out to historically marginalized groups, we contribute to a broader effort to make the region more peaceful and more prosperous. Thank you again for the opportunity to share our programs with you, and I look forward to your questions and guidance.
Thank you. I'd like to yield myself 5 minutes to ask a question, and then I'll go to the ranking member and the other members on the panel here today. This question is for both Ambassador Brownfield and Deputy Assistant Secretary Ayalde. There have been concerns about the Honduran government's efforts to confront corruption and criminality in its police force, and about State Department's FY 2012 certification of Honduras. In your estimation, has the Honduran government met the conditions for certification, and can you explain State's rationale in reaching that decision to certify? Second, what's the impact on your programs and progress from the Senate holding up the funding? Ambassador Brownfield, do you want to, or should we, do you want to, yeah, that's fine.
We have not issued the report yet. We are following it, the situation very carefully. Obviously, we are, like others, concerned with some of the issues of impunity and human rights. But we believe that our commitment is to the Honduran people, and we are looking for ways that we could continue to do so while adhering very closely to the legal restrictions.
And Mr. Chairman, from a programmatic perspective, the impact on our ability to conduct our programs is this. First, we try to have programs that directly attack the problem being evidence of corruption and, call it, misbehavior or abuse of authority in law enforcement and security elements. We attempt to address the problem by training at base level or basic level for those in the police and security forces, and second, by supporting the establishment of internal affairs divisions that are able to identify the corrupt or abusive individuals and eventually remove them from service. Second, we are applying the strictest possible vetting standards to those units and individuals with whom we work, by which I mean we use the community that assesses these matters, the human rights community, the legal community, the policy community, both here in Washington and in the field in Honduras, to determine which individuals and which units are reasonably believed to have committed these abuses in the past or continuing to commit them in the future. And those individuals and units we will not work with. We will find in some cases we apply a lesson by which we have 2 degrees of separation. For example, if a particularly senior official is found to have committed these abuses, we not only will not work with that official, we will not work with anyone that reports to that official. We will be at least 2 steps below that individual before we would work with anyone in that institution. What has been the impact of the Senate hold, Mr. Chairman? There is currently $10.3 million on hold. This funding would be used to support the ability of the Honduran National Police to conduct drug interdiction operations, particularly in the isolated northern region of the country. The impact of the hold at this point is our inability to deploy or support the deployment of Honduran National Police in that area. That in and of itself is not a disaster. The problem, of course, is just as you and I realize this, so do the drug traffickers. And as they realize that this is a zone where the police cannot reach, it obviously for them becomes a very inviting area through which to traffic their product.
Thank you. I'm going to yield back the balance of my time and recognize the ranking member.
You know, I read before where nearly $500 million have been appropriated for CARSI, and about $200 million have been appropriated for CBSI. Recently, the Government Accounting Office reports suggest that less than 28% of CARSI and roughly 90% of CBSI funds have been distributed. Can you expand upon that? Why it just seems that we could have done a better job appropriating more money?
Yes, sir. It did take a while to get started. In the Caribbean, we're working with 13 different governments with different levels of capacity, and we have to ensure that there were institutions that were going to be good partners in working that. I think it took a while to get started, but we are at the right pace right now where we're cranking up a number of activities. So only to say that we recognize the slow start, but we had to be comfortable and assure that there would be transparency in the use of funds and that the partners would be able to carry out their commitments. So we are at that place. In fact, it is unique to see that the governments of the region have taken the framework of CBSI as theirs. We believe that this is very positive. Other donors, including the Canadians who are helping us coordinate among all the donors that are participating in the Caribbean, are coordinating under the leadership of Canada, and they're also using the framework of CBSI. So it took a while to get started, but I think that we're at the right moment right now, so we recognize that slowness.
Congressman, if I could add a little bit of gloss from my side, and I'll run the specific figures by you. The GAO report was assessing a period of time that concluded with fiscal year 2011. Since then, we have gone through another whatever number of months we have since then, another 18 months. Things have happened in that period of time. Between 2008 and 2012, the INCL account, which I am responsible for CARSI, Central America, was $305 million. Of that $305 million, $294 million is now obligated. The remaining $11 million that is unobligated is the $10.3 million that I just described to Chairman Salmon, and another couple of $100,000 on another program. Of that sum, more than half has actually been spent. In other words, the obligation is us reaching agreement with the government on how it will be spent, and the spending, which is a separate process, has actually moved forward to well over 50% as opposed to the 20% number that you had. In the Caribbean, the figure is between 2010 and 2012 for our INCL funds, $95 million total, of which $83 million has been obligated, a figure of just under 90%. I expect that remaining $12 million to be obligated before the end of this fiscal year. Our liquidation rate has been a bit slower in the Caribbean than in Central America for the reasons that Liliana just indicated, which is to say we're starting up. We're coordinating with many different governments. This is not Plan Colombia or Merida, where we're coordinating with just one government. We're coordinating with 13 in the Caribbean or 7 in Central America. The coordination takes time. And finally, to be absolutely honest with you, We were starting at very close to point zero in terms of the personnel and staff that we had in the field, and I had to beef them up. I had to add additional staff to our sections in 3 of our 6 working Central American embassies, and we are adding additional personnel in the Caribbean. I think the story from this point on will be much better for you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Recognize Mr. Duncan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And the timeliness of this hearing is ironic. It was almost a year ago today that the Committee on Homeland Security Oversight Subcommittee that I now chair had a hearing on a very, very similar topic. On June 21st, we had a committee hearing titled The U.S. Caribbean Border, an Open Road for Drug Traffickers and Terrorists. We had the witnesses were the Honorable Luis Fortunio of Puerto Rico and Rear Admiral William Lee, Director of Operations, Policy, and Capabilities, United States Coast Guard. So during that hearing, we talked about the Caribbean region being possibly the potential to become an unlocked back door to the continental United States, not only for drug traffickers, but terrorists as well. And given the confluence of actors in the region, namely drug cartels, terrorist organizations like Hezbollah, antagonistic Latin American leaders like the former Hugo Chavez, the Caribbean has a potential to become a region hostile to the United States. What's more, given the Caribbean's geographical proximity to the United States mainland, this threat's even more unsettling. And during that hearing, we talked about the Caribbean being astride the major shipping lanes from South America, North America, and even Europe, how appealing that is to drug traffickers moving cocaine from South America and Mexico. So I say all that saying that this hearing is great as a follow-up to what we learned there. And then shortly thereafter, I traveled to Bogota and met with the Colombians and really learned about what we were doing with the Colombian government and helicopter training and a lot of other training to the tune of about $10 billion, I think, over a decade. And so the question I have is, do you see a segue to build on that Colombian experience? And then how do you see Colombia working in this? And I'll ask Ambassador Brownfield there because I certainly enjoy his testimony in Congress. He's come several times and I think is very knowledgeable. How do we see Colombia as possibly being an ally in the region to train maybe the Hondurans or the Guatemalans or El Salvadorans they may not come to the U.S. for training, but they may go to an ally within Latin America for training. So are they a willing partner? Do you see a benefit of that? And how may that help in the Caribbean nations as well? Ambassador?
Sure. Let me start, Congressman, and then yield to the good Dr. Ayalde or the good Dr. Lopez if they wish to add on. I think it is an excellent question, and even better, it's an opportunity for me to make a couple of points about Colombia, a country with whom I've had some considerable experience, including, I would like to think, 3 years during which we were trying to lay the groundwork for exactly what you have just described. I believe Colombia plays a very useful role in 2 senses. One, lessons that we have learned there, frequently the hard way, between January of 2000, when Congress first appropriated funds to support Plan Colombia, and today. Lessons in terms of how you do these sorts of programs, how you cooperate and collaborate, how you engage other partners, how you try to bring together the security side of a program with the developmental side of the program, how you sequence it, how you figure what your end game is so that we are not asking Congress to support a program forever. There are a lot of lessons that we have learned in Colombia that we can apply in Central America or the country to the immediate north of Central America or among the 14 countries of the Caribbean. The second important fact, and I use the word fact to talk about in the Colombia sense, is how Colombia itself plays as a service provider and supporter in these programs. Because let me be absolutely frank and blunt. Right now, the Colombian National Police is training more police and law enforcement in Central America than all of U.S. law enforcement put together. Now, some of it is supported by us, so in essence, it is CARSI funding, Plan Colombia funding, or in some cases even Merida funding that does this, and it does it because it is cheaper for us to have Colombian National Police provide this training than us doing it ourselves. Sometimes it is the Colombians themselves providing that training. They are at this point training in 4 of the 7 countries in Central America. They are providing training and support in the Dominican Republic, in the Caribbean. They are open to further engagement. I actually believe we get excellent value either by Colombians training in third countries or by us bringing law enforcement personnel from those third countries to train in many of the Colombian training institutions that we helped support and set up during Plan Colombia from the year 2000 to 2010. I think we actually should be looking forward and looking for ways to engage Colombia more and more effectively in this effort. From my perspective, it's a dividend that we get for our more than $9 billion of investment in support for Plan Colombia over the last 13 years.
Yeah, that's exactly the points I wanted to be brought out. I appreciate your service there, and my time's about out, but ma'am, you act like you want to chime in if the chairman will allow it.
Just very quickly to complement what the ambassador has mentioned, Colombia is also very eager to be engaged. We have included Colombia as a member of this North America SICA dialogue because of their interest at not only at the operational level, such as training and technical assistance, but also in providing some strategic guidance. For instance, whether there's a reform of the police, to give an example, in Honduras, whether there would be some value added in providing some guidance because of the experience, and we see that as a big plus. They've also expressed an interest and are engaged in the forums that we hold to coordinate strategic directions in the Caribbean. So just a compliment to what's been said.
Yeah, thank you so much. Those are the points I wanted to make, and I appreciate it. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Recognize Mr. Radel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Question, Mr. Lopez. Can you tell me if the programs in Central America have any kind of a list of individuals that we train with our CARSI funds? So what I'm getting at here, I'm curious, with our taxpayer dollars being spent, do we have a quantitative measure on how many people we're training, and maybe more importantly, how many we retain?
Certainly, thank you. I'll touch on our outreach centers, which I'm not sure is where your question's going, but then maybe I can ask a follow-up. I think we've got a range of programs in Central America focused on at-risk youth and municipal capacity building. Some of that has a training element, some of that has an outreach element. We've got 100 centers throughout the Northern Triangle countries as well as in Panama. Combined, those efforts in 2012 have reached about 90,000 people. As I mentioned in my opening statement, there's a lot of secondary benefits to individuals who are involved in these outreach centers. Sometimes these are youth at risk. We've also got more structured training programs in terms of employment opportunities and job generation work that we use to target in particular areas where people are vulnerable to engaging in either illicit activities or gang activities. In terms of impact, we've seen encouraging results. We've also looked at, in a scientific way, and I know that this committee is concerned with impact rather than just output, and we as well are concerned not just in the region but around the world. As USAID, we've got a treatment and control group of communities whereby we looked scientifically according to a series of factors with a baseline and a midterm. That study is not over yet, but the midterm evaluation has shown statistically significant impact in terms of the treatment communities doing better than those control communities.
So those are kind of qualitative measures. Do we have lists of, look, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I mean, we pay people, right? That have roles that play within this. Do we have knowledge lists of who these people are and whether we retain them over a certain amount of time that continue to do the work?
Certainly. I mean, we'd be happy to follow up in terms of whether it's individuals or profiles, and whatever information that would be helpful.
Okay, so it would be clerks, judges, police officers that are all
Understood.
part
Yeah,
of it?
in terms of the justice reform programs and the work in terms of training for judicial officials, we can certainly provide you with details on exactly who these individuals are.
And police officers.
If it's police, Congressman, the reason Mark is ducking that question, if it's police, I do it. And yes, we do it, and we can provide those sorts of numbers for you.
Okay, great. We'll get that then in writing. Thank you. I appreciate your time. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield the rest of my time.
Thank you. We would like to get to the next panel, but before I do have a question, I'd like to just ask and have you submit in writing. I don't want to trouble us with, I know you've been already detained way too long. But my question would be, Ambassador Brownfield, CARSI aid is divided among 7 countries. Actually, all 3 of you, if you could submit any relevant answers to this. The CARSI aid is divided among 7 countries as well as regional programs. How much funding has been allocated to each country, and how are those allocation decisions being made? Are any of the countries not receiving any or certain types of CARSI aid at this time? And if so, why not? And finally, to what extent is CARSI aid tied to demonstrations of political will by partner governments? And do we have an idea of how much the region spends on their own security for every dollar the United States contributes? And I want to thank you very much. And I'll have staff provide those questions to you as well. But if you could respond back, I'd really appreciate it. And thank you so much for your patience today, and thank you so much for your wonderful testimony, and it's always a pleasure. Oh, we have one more question. I'm sorry. Representing me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry about sneaking in there. I had my Financial Service Committee, we had some votes going on. But I did not want to miss the opportunity to ask a few questions to this distinguished panel that we have before us on topics that are most important to me. And I just want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, also, though, for your focus on regional security concerns, as a top priority for this subcommittee. I think it's exactly the right place. But let me not dilly-dally. Let me just go straight to a couple of questions that I don't believe were asked, because my staff was listening and told me which questions were and were not. Mr. Sears may have asked everything, but I didn't ask it all. So, in regards to the overall dealing with the Caribbean drug transshipment, overall the use of the Caribbean as a transshipment point for illicit drugs from South America to the United States, I'm told, has diminished over the past 10 to 15 years as drug traffickers have shifted primarily to using Mexico and Central America corridor. What's your assessment of the current status of drug transshipment through the Caribbean, and have you seen any increase recently due to law enforcement efforts in Mexico and Central America? Let me add on to that, to what extent is the Caribbean equipped to contend with an increase in the use of the region for drug transshipments, and to what extent has the CBSI helped increase the interdiction and law enforcement capacity of the Caribbean nations to contend with the increase in illicit drug trafficking? Just a few questions.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sure I speak for the entire panel when I say we would be deeply disappointed were we not to have received any questions from the distinguished gentleman from Queens. I will be delighted to offer at least the start of an answer on these, and let my friends Drs. Ayalde and Lopez follow up as they think appropriate. What have we seen by way of trends of drug shipments moving through the Caribbean? Here is my simple answer to that question, Congressman. We see drug transshipments through the Caribbean is still a tiny percentage of that which moves through Central America and Mexico, but it is growing. In between 2011 and 2012, the last year for which we put together reasonably good statistics so far, since traffickers do not report their business to official government institutions, we calculate that the amount that has been transshipping through the region has jumped from 5% to 9% of the total that is coming to the United States of America, nearly doubling. The overwhelming majority of that flows through the island of Hispaniola, the Dominican Republic and Haiti, and probably the majority of that flows through Hispaniola flows through the Dominican Republic. The trend, therefore, is obviously moving in an upward direction. And I would add a second point. It is perfectly logical that that happen. The logic is as follows. In the early 2000s, we squeezed them in Colombia, and a lot of them moved their operations to Mexico. Beginning in 2007, 2008, we started to squeeze them in Mexico, and they moved into the Central American region. Starting around 2009, we began to squeeze them in Central America. What are they going to do? One option is that they all go out of business, open beach cabanas, and live happily ever after as entrepreneurs. The other is they will look for an alternative and cheaper place to do business. And when they start that search, the Caribbean and those old networks that we took down in the 1980s and the 1990s are going to look very attractive. And that, Congressman, is what CBSI, from my perspective, is all about. We are investing in the future. We are trying to build both the capabilities and the cooperation among the 13 cooperating governments of the region so that they will be prepared to address this reality that I see coming down the road. We are talking about many states that are very small, vulnerable because they do not have the resources and the personnel to perform this mission, who require this degree of cooperation and support from us in order to be able to do it. If we do our job right today, this is not a story in 2 years' time. We'll know in 2 years whether we have done our job right.
If I may, sir, just to add to that, everything that is being done is done through the optic of institution building. To give an example, we have 2 advisors from ATF that are posted in the Caribbean to provide technical assistance on trafficking of small arms. It's a big issue in the Caribbean, and they are overwhelmed with how to deal with it. The advisor has been placed in a regional institution. They are being encouraged to share information, which is not very natural for them. But the idea is that they'll get the procedures, the way things are done to track these small arms. They are being trained, and they will have the know-how of where to go with this information and what to do with it. So. Again, it's about institution building, making sure that what we do is not just for today, but for tomorrow.
Let me just ask this, Chairman, with my, also, let me just ask about, when we did Plan Colombia, we also had a part dealing with economic development in the area so that the locals would not have to resort to selling drugs, et cetera, when that happened. So are we still doing the same thing here? Are we doing enough with to encourage the economic and, as you talked about, institutional development while we work on security also?
I have to admit that that is an ongoing challenge because these are small states. In many cases, they are struggling with their fiscal health. You may be very familiar, for instance, with Jamaica and how much we worked with them to try to get them to sign the IMF agreement and some of the very hard choices they have to make. So we have to look at it, and this is what President Obama has been saying, the investment in the economy and that prosperity is essential to the sustainability of anything we do in security. It is a challenge in the case of the Caribbean because they are small states. They depend a lot on tourism, and so and we have limited resources. AID is present in a very limited way, and so we don't have as many tools. But what we do have is more creative ways of working with the business sector. For instance, I am traveling to Barbados in about a week to launch the American Chamber of Commerce there to be working in the Eastern Caribbean, and we're encouraged to be able to attract more business and investment.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I just would request that, it was a little bit late, but can I ask unanimous consent to submit my opening statement for the record?
Absolutely, without objection.
I don't know why you all do that.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much for your testimony. We really appreciate it. And thanks again for your patience.
What is that? You know what? I got to decide whether we call him this reporter back. I got two reporters.
Good luck to you.
We'd like to go ahead and welcome our second panel and all of us. Thank you so much for being here. Let's go ahead and run through the bios real quick here. Eric Olson, a member of our second panel here, is the Associate Director of the Latin American Program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. His research and writing is focused primarily on security issues and the impacts of crime, organized crime, and violence on democracies. He's also written about reform of police and judicial institutions as a vehicle for addressing the problem of rapidly expanding crime in the Americas, which is what we're dealing with here today. Now, prior to joining the Wilson Center, he was a senior specialist in the Department for Promotion of Good Governance at the Organization of American States from 2006 to 2007. Mr. Olson also holds a BA from Trinity College in History and Secondary Education and a master's degree in International Affairs from American University. Again, thank you for being here. Over to Mr. Michael Shifter. Mr. Shifter is the president of the Inter-American Dialogue. Since 1993, Mr. Shifter has been an adjunct professor at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, where he teaches Latin American politics, which is a little complicated from time to time. Prior to joining the Inter-American Dialogue, Mr. Shifter directed the Latin American and Caribbean program at the National Endowment for Democracy. Mr. Shifter holds a BA from Oberlin College in Sociology and Political Science and a master's degree in Sociology from Harvard University. We will go ahead and go along with the testimonies, and I will start with Mr. Olson. You are recognized.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate your staying on and overseeing this hearing. And thank you also to Mr. Meeks. I know he spent a lot of time looking at issues of democracy and and security in Latin America, particularly in the Andes region. So thank you for being here as well. I've submitted some written testimony to the committee already, so I'd like to, with your permission, just make some summary remarks on that. On that. I just came back from 10 days in Central America, in the Northern Triangle, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. So much of what I say reflects that 10-day travel to the region. But I also lived in Honduras for 2 years in the 1980s and have repeatedly traveled to the region over the last 20, 25 years. And while I consider myself an optimist at heart, hopeful by nature, I have to admit that I feel a bit of sense of deja vu listening to our panel before us. All wonderful people that I have enormous respect for. But some of what we've been talking about here today is the same things we were talking about 20 years ago. Building institutions, strengthening capacity, so on and so forth. And so there's a time at which one has to ask oneself, are we really being successful? Are we really doing the right things? And I don't question the goal. The problem is not the goal, it's the method to getting there. And I do have to say that I have some serious questions about how we are going about it, simply because it's not producing the results we'd like to see, and to be honest, what the people of Central America want to see and deserve to see. So that I just offer as a preface. I would just say in a word that the security situation in the Northern Triangle, in particular Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, is dire. I don't want to call it a crisis, but it is dire. Organized crime and trafficking is rampant, and we're no longer talking just about drug trafficking. We're talking about human trafficking, trafficking in minerals, gold increasingly, other minerals, petroleum products. I mean, you name it, there's trafficking going on. And what that means is that the income from those businesses is phenomenal, and the coercive effects of that kind of trafficking is tremendous. Gangs, especially in El Salvador and Honduras, are a daily reality for people in big urban areas. And although there's been a truce declared in El Salvador and the homicide rates have gone down, extortion is still rampant. People are afraid of taking buses because they get held up consistently and regularly. So that's an issue. One of my missions on this trip was to begin an assessment of the borders in Central America. And you can only imagine the number of problems. To say it's porous and open borders is to say the obvious. There are 8 official crossings between Guatemala and Mexico, and 122 estimated informal crossings. And I'm not talking about footpaths. These are areas where trucks drive across rivers and where boats traverse rivers without any kind of control. Conversely and ironically, at the official ports of entry, there's enormous inefficiency for commerce, legitimate commerce, where there's high levels of corruption, and trucks and people bringing products in are stuck for days on end. So the situation, again, is dire. There are areas of the countries where there is no effective state presence. Areas of the region where there's no effective state presence. And even in areas where there are authorities who are elected, many times, and I don't want to overstate it, but many times those authorities are on the payroll or themselves engaged in trafficking. And this is particularly troublesome along Honduras and the Guatemalan border, where there's really very little state presence. I wanted to just go ahead and say a couple more things. I see 2 problems in Central America that need to be addressed. First of all, success in Central America depends essentially on the Central Americans themselves and their capacity and willingness to make the tough decisions. And unfortunately, many cases that has not been the case, done. Oftentimes there's promise of reform, initiatives to reform, there's purging and vetting, but the fundamental kinds of reforms that create greater transparency and greater accountability, and I think you were actually getting at this issue as well. We're training people, but we don't have a clear sense of what that outcome is. How is that really turning things around? I think it's an indicator of how we need to adjust our strategy in Central America to make it more effective, have better outcomes, not just better inputs. And I also think that one of the problems is that since we focus so much on drugs, we tend to reduce everything to every problem in Central America as primarily a drugs problem. And I think, frankly, while obviously drugs and drug trafficking are a big problem, we need to have a broader approach to the region that's not just focused on drugs and getting the drug cartels, but to also do, as some of you had implied, look at the economic situation, look at the healthcare system, look at the education system, because if you don't start from a broader perspective and start to reestablish the capacity of the state at many levels, I think the likelihood and hope for change in that region goes down quite a bit. I would focus anything we were to do going forward on building or defining basic benchmarks for transparency and accountability. Again, simply training people is not going to solve the problem. We've been investing in rule of law and justice reform in Central America for probably 20 years at least. And we're still with the situation of a justice system in Honduras that basically doesn't work. We have police forces in Central America, and particularly in Honduras, where last Monday while I was there, the Minister of Security said that he found over 400 people on the police rolls who didn't exist. He called them ghosts, people who were collecting salaries and doing no police work. So without greater transparency on all of these fronts, I think we can continue to train people, we can continue to send equipment, we can continue to provide information, but that's the kind of fundamental building blocks that we need to start with in the region. Obviously, in 5 minutes, can't cover it all. I'll leave it there. I'm happy to answer any of your questions, and I think there's a lot more information in my written testimony. Thank you very much.
Mr. Olson, I thank you. We now go to Mr. Shifter.
Thank you very much, Congressman Rodell, and thank you, Congressman Meeks. Good to see you. The security situation in Central America and the Caribbean is very serious. It varies from country to country. It has different explanations in each country, but overall the trend is worsening and very worrying. Criminal violence poses a great challenge to the rule of law and to fragile democracies. The situation can and should be addressed by countries in both regions and by the regional organizations such as SICA and CARICOM. But the United States has enormous responsibility and also the capacity to assist. The economic and demographic ties to both regions are profound and are growing. The U.S.'s own strategic interests are at stake. Skepticism about whether the U.S. can help is understandable, but should be put in perspective. I recall testifying before Congress 13 years ago about Plan Colombia, and everyone asked the question, is there any precedent for the U.S. providing some sustained support to another country in the world that has helped strengthen the capacity of the state and led to reduced violence? Back then, there were no good answers to that question. Today, it is possible to cite the example of Plan Colombia itself. U.S. cooperation did not solve Colombia's problems, but it did contribute to reducing the security problem in an important and positive way. 2013 is not 2000, and there are so many differences between Colombia and Central America and the Caribbean today. But the core problem of governance and lawlessness applies to both situations. Both CARSI and CBSI are useful and important steps, but the programs are not enough. Despite the cooperation, crime and violence in a number of countries are worsening, not improving. In Honduras, murder rates increased by some 50% between 2008 and 2012, precisely the time period in which these programs were implemented. And even where violence has dropped, the U.S. support has been too modest and could be more effectively targeted. CARSI and CBSI are comprehensive and wide-ranging cooperation programs. They combine traditional counter-narcotics activities with institution building and crime prevention measures. There has been a welcome shift in resources towards the latter, but the counter-narcotics control and law enforcement still account for a significant share of the assistance. Over the long term, the best investment, the wisest investment, is in institution building. Drug trafficking is a key element in spreading violence and weakening institutions. It needs to be addressed. But levels of cocaine seizures, the main metric used to measure success in U.S. security aid, are not directly correlated with homicide rates. Even when the share of cocaine trafficked in the Caribbean has been reduced, the murder rates have more than doubled over the last decade. It is critical that resources be delivered in a timely manner and that they be commensurate with the huge challenges. According to the GAO, disbursements both in CARSI and CBSI have been delayed. It is commendable that in this difficult fiscal environment, there will be more resources for CARSI in next year's budget. Resources are not everything, but they are important, and the U.S. should see this region as a high priority and be prepared to even increase funding should circumstances warrant. The U.S. should not limit its policy to Central America and the Caribbean to security cooperation programs. Diplomatic instruments and political pressures should also be brought to bear to engage other governments in the region to be more helpful. The role of Mexico and Colombia was referred to in the last panel, are especially critical, but other governments as well in the region need to be helpful and supportive. Central America is also sensitive to U.S. domestic policy issues. The U.S. should seriously engage in a review of drug policy, should manage deportations to the countries in the region with greater sensitivities to how they affect security, and it should do more to stop illegal arms from entering the region. The U.S. should recognize that there is a great opportunity for collaboration in the region. President Obama and Vice President Biden's recent visits illustrate the goodwill in both the Central America and the Caribbean. And Colombia shows that sustained U.S. support can make a difference. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I look forward to any questions you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Shifter. I now yield myself 5 minutes to ask some questions. Committee hearing after committee hearing, Colombia always is this bright, shining example of what we can do when we work together, foster an economy, work on security, national security issues, et cetera, where we go from what was almost a failed state to what we have now, Colombia, the GDP booming, growing. But, Mr. Shifter, you pointed out how you cannot have a one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to these types of issues. And you noted some of the differences between Colombia and present-day Central America. I would ask you, could you expand on that a little more? What are the differences, and how can we better direct resources based on that?
Well, thank you. I mean, I think Colombia has an internal armed conflict is a major difference. It's a political conflict. There's now a peace process in Colombia. Colombia clearly is one country as opposed to small countries, as Ambassador Brownfield underscored. Major coca producer. The Plan Colombia was directed at eradicating coca in the coca production in southern Colombia. So I think there are enormous differences with it, and this is mainly a problem of trafficking. That really, this is the routes, the transit routes that go through. So I think there are some real differences. But The problem in Colombia was called, on the brink of a failed state, and now some of these countries are called failed states. So there are similarities in terms of basic structures of governance and questions of accountability, transparency, corruption. These issues were brought up in the context of Plan Colombia as well. So I do think that you tackle a very, very, very similar kind of problem. What I think is needed is a much more engaged approach, even than we had in Colombia. Colombia is a country with a strong democratic tradition, stronger than many of the Central American countries. So they were a partner that you can work with, and I think in Central America, I think ultimately the responsibility is with the Central Americans themselves. But I do think beyond just security assistance programs, there needs to be a much more engaged and focused targeted approach by the United States.
And that's where we get back to institutional support versus just, gee, how many kilos of cocaine have we seized today? And Mr. Olson, if you'd want to expand on that, that's kind of what you were getting at as well, right? That institutional support, whether we're talking the justice system, education, things like that?
I totally agree with what everyone has said, that institutional support is essential. What I'm trying to get at is that in some ways we've been trying to do that for a long time and not terribly successfully. And so what I'm suggesting is maybe we need to take a little bit different approach to it, that the focus not be so much on training, not that I'm against training, but that not be the main focus of what we do, and we instead try to start with issues of transparency and accountability. Let me give you a couple examples. Again, Minister Corrales in Honduras discovered that there were 400+ police officers that didn't exist receiving salaries, 162 missing vehicles, expensive communication, brand new, never taken out of the package. That kind of problem you don't solve by training more people, because they're coming into a system of corruption, of penetration, of capture of the state. And so I'm trying to say is that maybe the first building block here is to push them to have more transparent procedures. Nobody in Honduras can tell you how many cases have been opened, how many have been investigated, how many have been prosecuted, and how many have been sentenced. Basic information so that you could judge whether there is any progress. We keep training and training and training, but the system stays basically the same. And though it's not a question of institution strengthening or not, it's how you're going to do the institution strengthening that makes a difference. And I think, that's the key to me.
Okay, Mr. Olson, I thank you for your time, and look, I'm the eternal optimist like you. I hope that we can have a brighter future in this and implementing. Again, I go back to those kind of qualitative and quantitative measures to address what you've discussed. I think it's important that this committee too recognize if there are issues like that, if our funds are being directed or mismanaged in any way, tied into some of these issues that you've brought up, I hope that we can address that. At this point, I will go ahead, and my time has expired. Mr. Meeks, you're recognized.
Thank you. I was going to call you Mr. Chairman, but I see the chairman is back, so I don't want him to think there's anything funny going on here.
You can still call me Mr. Chair.
Let me, again, thank you for your dedication and your focus on issues of concern, especially in Latin America and Central and South America. I'm wondering, going back to the conversation that we were just having, and oftentimes Colombia is subject matter of which we bring up. Now, it seems to me maybe one of the fundamental differences have been, and you tell me, is leadership. From the top going down with, getting a word out that I want transparency. Because if the leadership doesn't say, I want transparency, then, wherever the money goes, it is going to be gone without having transparency. So talk to me about leadership in some of the key areas where we are investing money or where we should not invest money, and how do we do that so that we can make sure that there's accountability, eventually transparency, and get on a pathway as we did in Colombia.
I was going to defer to the chairman over here, but I mean, I think that's a very valid point and a good point. And again, like Michael said, you know, each country is different. I think the Millennium Challenge account has made transparency and governance an essential part of its program, and there's been progress in that in El Salvador, for instance. I think there's been progress in Guatemala because Guatemala has had the good fortune of having an attorney general who herself is courageous and has held people accountable. But I, frankly, am pessimistic about what I've heard and seen in Honduras. And part of it is there's been a revolving door. They've had 3 public security ministers in just over 3 years. And each one comes in with a new agenda and a new reform plan and really going to shake things up. And, you know, that's, you know, more power to them. But it, you know, never takes hold, and we never quite make it beyond that. So that's why looking at the sort of the systemic part of this, the transparency part, is really important. And you know, if there were that kind of leadership committed in the long term, then I would say there's even more hope.
Shift.
Yeah, thank you. I think, you know, you make a great point, Congressman. You know, in Colombia, what Colombia happened is that basically said this country is no longer viable if the situation continues the way it's been going. And so in that context, leadership emerged that kind of tapped into something that was out there, and we haven't quite seen that yet in Central America. Part of the problem is that there is a very difficult challenge in coordinating efforts. Each one is a different situation. There's some mistrust, frankly, among the governments, and you really have to have somebody that really plays that role. No one has really stepped forward yet to really assume that role of coordinating the region because everything's on the line. And that's really what happened in Colombia. It's easier to do it in one country than it is in many, especially when there's such different circumstances. But I think in terms of U.S. policy, there are reformers in each of the countries. I think Honduras, as Eric said, is the most problematic, troubling. If you had to single out the most difficult one, I think it would be Honduras. But in Guatemala, you have an attorney general. In other countries, you have people in leadership positions that I think you can be supported, you can work with. And I think the effort should just be to focus and to strengthen those individuals are in leadership positions, if not the president, at least in the judicial branch or in Congress or in other institutions that are key.
Well, let me ask, how do we, you know, I'm always been curious, those individuals that we may have in various institutions in various countries that seem to be moving in the right direction, where do they come from? How do we find them? Is it civil society? If it don't come from the top, what do we do to make sure that there are more of them, that we are creating more of them, or that we are educating or teaching more of them so that we have more of them coming from the ground swell up as opposed to leaving that vacuum?
Well, I think that's a great point, and that's why I say we can't have just such a narrow focus on fighting drugs. We have to look more broadly because we got to identify leaders with possibility and that can move this forward, and they may come from unexpected places. Again, trying to be optimistic even about Honduras, the one bright light I see in Honduras is actually the university. A university that traditionally has been abandoned, underfunded, corrupt, you name it, now has a rector who is viewed as an honest person, who is doing new and innovative things at the university. She's created an observatory on violence that's actually creating documentation schemes of, you know, who's getting murdered, where. The government's not doing that. She's doing it. So there's somebody that, you know, is not in government and is outside and maybe on the periphery, but I think she's beginning to create a space in Honduras that's legitimate, and maybe we can build something there.
I can see my time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Meeks. I now recognize the chair.
Thank you. How has, either of you can answer this question. Actually, it's a couple of questions. How has DOD supplemented the assistance provided through CARSI? And what have been the principal accomplishments of DOD support for Central America thus far? How will the budget cuts affect the interdiction and training efforts moving forward? And what other major challenges for interagency cooperation? And how would you expect, or how would you respond to concerns that U.S. assistance is being provided to militaries that still experience widespread impunity for human rights violations and criminal activity? Thank you.
I'm not sure I have an exact answer for you. I'd like to be able to respond in writing. I mean, I take it by DOD you mean their counter-narcotics assistance, because there is a DOD presence or a State Department presence in Honduras at the Soto base, but that's not a counter-narcotics function. Southcom has numerous programs in the area that are counter-narcotics focused. I'm beginning to look at this issue of border and border security, and I know DOD is doing, Southcom is doing quite a bit in Belize, in Guatemala, to try to increase the capacity of the militaries in those countries to patrol the borders. I don't have numbers around that, and I don't know much more than that, but I do know they have a presence. What the sequester impact will be on all these programs, I just couldn't tell you in honesty.
And either one of you, happy to have you answer. How would you respond to concerns that U.S. assistance is being provided to militaries that still experience widespread impunity for human rights violations and criminal activity?
Well, I think this is a concern. I mean, Central America, as you know, has a very troubling history, and one of the achievements in Central Americans is precisely the reduction of the military over the recent period. And the worst thing that the United States could do would be to strengthen those military forces for non-military purposes, for what should be just law enforcement purposes. But the problem is that the police are not adequate to the task, and there's a lot of public pressure for order. And if the military is the only institution that can do that, that's a real dilemma. That's a real problem. So I think that's a very, very strong concern. I guess I would respond with a question that if the United States doesn't provide support to those militaries, with those countries, those militaries are going to do anyway. And this at least gives the United States some leverage and ability to try to constrain those abuses, because these situations are out of control. No other institution can provide order, and I don't think the U.S. wants to sit by and say, well, we're not part of this, but look what they're doing down there. And I think it's better. I think this was the Colombian case. If you go back to Colombia, human rights has been a central part of that program, and there has been a reduction in human rights abuses, in part thanks to the pressure applied here from Washington.
Thank you. Prisons throughout Central America are overcrowded and in substandard conditions. Moreover, they've become recruitment centers for criminal gangs, further complicating the security situation in the region. What are the governments of these countries doing to address these serious problems?
I know that in the case of Honduras, the U.S. had, I believe it was about a $10 million program to help reform and strengthen the prison system there, because not only was it grossly overcrowded, but it was, the prisons were actually platforms for organized crime, and we had these horrific examples of prison fires and riots where hundreds of people were being killed. So there was a real interest in dealing with this problem there. And the U.S. said, before we give you this money, we have a few conditions. No more cell phones in the prison, segregate the prisoners, keep minors out of the adult population, some basic criteria. And the government was unable to meet those basic criteria. So the U.S. said, we're not giving you $10 million. As much as it's needed, as important as it is, if you can't make some basic standards, you don't have the will to do some basic things, we're not giving you the money. So, it's a real dilemma, because the problem, as you say, is extreme. Now, there are better prisons. They've improved prison conditions in El Salvador. They've improved prison conditions in other countries. But when a country doesn't have the basic fundamental commitment to make some minimal changes, one has to ask oneself, is this the right way to invest our money? I think they did, but the situation has not improved.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you both, gentlemen. It's been very productive. I think it gives us a little clarity moving forward on the realities of this, the cultural realities to this, which is a theme that just keeps coming up in this. You can only do so much. People have to want to help themselves. And when, as stewards of taxpayer dollars, it's imperative that we look at this very critically, especially given our own economy and our own budget here in the United States. Gentlemen, thank you both. With there being no further business, the subcommittee is adjourned.